Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be sharing a realistic fiction story called Alejandro's Gift by Richard E. Albert, illustrated by Sylvia Long. This read aloud is intended for elementary students, but of course people of all ages are welcome to listen, and I do hope you enjoy. I'm going to be asking some questions during the story for you to think about. If you're watching with someone else, you could pause the video at those times and share your ideas with each other if you'd like to. Now, many of us have been spending a lot of time at home. Have you had any moments lately when you've been at home and you've started to get a lonely or a bored feeling? I know I've felt that way at times. Well, in this realistic fiction book, Alejandro faces some problems. You see, he lives in the desert in the southwestern United States, and you can start to get a sense of the environment where he lives here on the title page. You can see the saguaro cactus and the Gila woodpecker. And here's his ranch where he lives by himself. And he starts feeling lonely and bored, living all the way out there all alone. You can also get a sense of the dry climate where he lives. Notice his well, how he gets his water, pulls it out of the ground using a windmill. Okay, so that's important in this story. Now, as we read Alejandro's Gift, pay attention to how Alejandro reacts to the problems that he faces. We'll talk about Alejandro's solutions to these problems at the end of the story. I just love the illustrations in this book. Like, look at this illustration of the desert. Isn't that beautiful? Readers pause to think about what meaning the illustrator is adding to the text. So as we read, I'm going to try to show you the illustrations really clearly. And we'll stop and do some thinking about those illustrations during the story. Alejandro's Gift. Alejandro's small adobe house stood beside a lonely desert road. Beside the house stood a well and a windmill to pump water from the well. Water for Alejandro and for his only companion, a burro, or a donkey. It was a lonely place, and Alejandro welcomed any who stopped by to refresh themselves at the well. But visitors were few, and after they left, Alejandro felt lonelier than ever. To more easily endure the lonely hours, Alejandro planted a garden filled with carrots, beans, and large brown onions, tomatoes, and corn, melons, squash, and small red peppers. Most mornings found Alejandro tending the garden, watching it grow. These were times he cherished, and he often stayed for hours, working until driven indoors by the desert heat. The days went by, one after another, with little change, until one morning when there was an unexpected visitor. This visitor came not from the desert road, but from the desert itself. A ground squirrel crept from the underbrush. Moving warily over the sand, it hesitated and looked around. Alejandro paused, keeping very quiet as the squirrel approached the garden. It ran up to one of the furrows, drank its fill of water, and scampered away. After it left, Alejandro realized that for those few moments, his loneliness had been all but forgotten. And because he felt less lonely, Alejandro found himself hoping the squirrel would come again. Now, readers, pause for a moment to notice this illustration. What meaning does the illustrator add to this page of the story? For example, I wasn't quite sure what the author meant when he said that the squirrel came up to one of the furrows and drank its fill of water. But when I studied the illustration, I saw this little ditch that Alejandro had dug all around his garden to bring water from the well and irrigate his vegetable plants. And I noticed that the squirrel was coming right up to that, and I realized that must be what a furrow is. So the illustrator helped me understand how Alejandro's garden looks, and it helped me understand what a furrow is. See how I did that? Stopped and studied the illustration. We'll do that in a few more places, so keep looking. The squirrel did come again, from time to time bringing along small friends. Wood rats and pocket gophers, Jackrabbits, kangaroo rats, pocket mice. Birds, too, became aware of Alejandro's garden. Roadrunners, Gila woodpeckers, thrashers, cactus wrens, sage sparrows, mourning doves, and others came in the evening to perch on the branches of a mesquite bush or to rest on the arms of a lone saguaro, before dropping down for a quick drink before nightfall. Occasionally, even an old desert tortoise could be seen plodding toward the garden. Suddenly, Alejandro found that time was passing more quickly. He was rarely lonely. He had only to look up from his hoe or from wherever he might be at any moment to find a small friend nearby. For a while, this was all that mattered to Alejandro. But after a time, he wasn't so sure. He began asking himself if there was something more important than just making himself less lonely. It took Alejandro little time to see there was. He began to realize that his tiny desert friends came to his garden not for company, but for water, and he found himself thinking of the other animals in the desert. Animals like the coyote and the desert gray fox, the bobcats, the skunks, the badgers, the long-nosed coatis, the peccaries, sometimes called javelinas, the short-tempered wild pigs of the desert, the antlered mule deer, the does, and the fawns. Finding enough water was not a problem. With his windmill and well, Alejandro could supply ample water for any and all. Getting it to those who needed it was something else. The something else, Alejandro decided, was a desert waterhole. Without delay, Alejandro started digging. It was tiring work, taking many days in the hot desert sun. But the thought of giving water to so many thirsty desert dwellers more than made up for the drudgery. And when it was filled, Alejandro was pleased with the gift he had made for his desert friends. There was good reason to suppose it would take time for the larger animals to discover their new source of water. So Alejandro was patient. He went about as usual, feeding his burro, tending the garden, and doing countless other chores. Days passed, and nothing happened. Still, Alejandro was confident. But the days turned to weeks, and it was still quiet at the waterhole. Why, Alejandro wondered, weren't they coming? What could he have done wrong? Readers, do you notice anything in this illustration? One thing I noticed is Alejandro dug the waterhole very close to where he lives, right near the rest of his property. I wonder if the wild animals are going to want to come that close to where the humans. The absence of the desert folk might have remained a mystery had Alejandro not come out of the house one morning when a skunk was in the clearing beyond the waterhole. Seeing Alejandro, the skunk darted to safety in the underbrush. It suddenly became very clear why Alejandro's gift was being shunned. Alejandro couldn't believe he'd been so thoughtless, but what was important now was to put things right as quickly as possible. Waterhole number 2 was built far from the house and screened by heavy desert growth. When it was filled and ready, Alejandro waited with mixed emotions. He was hopeful, yet he couldn't forget what had happened the first time. As it turned out, he was not disappointed. The animals of the desert did come, each as it made its own discovery. Because the waterhole was now sheltered from the small adobe house and the desert road, the animals were no longer fearful. And although Alejandro could not see through the desert growth surrounding the waterhole, he had ways of knowing it was no longer being shunned. By the twitter of birds gathering in the dusk, by the rustling of the mesquite in the quiet desert evening, telling of the approach of a coyote, a badger, or maybe a desert fox, by the soft hoofbeats of a mule deer, or the unmistakable sound of a herd of peccaries charging toward the waterhole. Readers, do you notice anything in this illustration that helps you understand something about the story? And in these moments, when Alejandro sat quietly listening to the sounds of his desert neighbors, he knew that the gift was not so much a gift that he had given, but a gift he had received. I hope you enjoyed that story, Alejandro's gift. Let's think a little bit about how Alejandro reacted to the problems he faced. So first of all, he was pretty lonely and bored at the beginning of the story. What did he do to solve that problem? Well, he took action, right? He decided to plant a garden, which was a great outdoor activity to keep him occupied. Now, later in the story, he noticed a problem for the animals that were living near his property. He noticed that they were seeking a better water source. So what did he do to solve that problem? He decided to dig a watering hole for them, right? And he needed to do it twice in order to figure out the best way to do it. So what do you notice about how Alejandro fixes problems? I noticed that he's a pretty proactive person. He looks for things that he could help make better. And I also noticed that the way he solved his problems were not just good for himself. They were good for others, and they were good for the environment. So the last question for you, what was Alejandro's gift? Was it a gift that he gave, or was it a gift that he received? Do hope you enjoyed this one. If you ever find this book and you want to read it yourself, I will show you there's a great nonfiction section here in the back that highlights all of the animals that are featured in the story. So that's a pretty cool additional science learning opportunity from that book, Alejandro's Gift. So friends, last week in honor of Earth Day, we challenged students to identify ways that they could improve habitat for pollinators or wildlife at home. Just like Alejandro provided a water source for the animals, that made me think of the National Wildlife Federation's Backyard Wildlife Habitat Program that we mentioned in last week's project. Go back and take a look at that project if you're interested in enhancing the habitat where you live. You know, that could be something as simple as planting some native flowers in a container on your front steps or your balcony, creating a brush pile for some shelter for small animals, or planting a tree or maintaining a bird bath. Now this week, with so many plants sprouting outside, we decided to focus on seed germination and gardening for our enrichment activities. Experimenting with seed germination or getting outdoors to grow some plants, just like Alejandro did, might be a great home project for you and your family. I have to say though, unless the rabbits and deer are as polite where you live as they were in Alejandro's garden, you might need some fencing to protect your veggies. Be well, everybody. Thanks for watching.